Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me for today's video. I hope that you are all well and safe and taking care of yourselves as best as you can right now. If you're new here, my name is Emily and I'm creating videos around tarot, magic, witchcraft, spirituality, all of those kinds of topics. So if you would like to see more from me along those lines, then please do stick around and consider subscribing. So today I'm going to do some more prompts from Ethony Dawn's hashtag 31 days of tarot. So let's just get started. So I'm up to day 22 and for this prompt it asks, if you were shipwrecked on a desert island, which 5 tarot or oracle decks would you want to have with you and why? I find this so hard. I'm sure a lot of other people find this hard too, and I could really agonize over this for a very, very long time. I have decided to not take any oracle decks because I just want to use up the space with tarot, so that's what I have done. And I've picked decks based on them being favourites, but also having connections to those decks and having kind of nostalgia around those decks as well. So first up, I would have to take my first deck, which is the original Rider-Waite-Smith, I think it's called, and it's the really yellowy deck with these backs. So this deck is really quite yellowy and a lot of people don't consider it to be very pretty at all, but it is a Rider-Waite-Smith deck obviously, and it is the original deck that I first bought. This deck itself isn't the first deck I ever had because I first learnt tarot when I was 17, 18 and I'm now in my 30s, and a few years after I learnt tarot I stopped using tarot, so I got rid of the first copy that I had. I think I took it to a charity shop or something. So it was probably about 4 years ago that I repurchased this and threw myself back into tarot reading again. This isn't physically the actual deck that I first learnt from when I was 17, but this is the same deck. So for me, this is a really nostalgic kind of piece, and even though it's yellowy and even though it's not the prettiest, I would have to have this. I think it's just really, really nice to have a Rider-Waite-Smith deck anyway, so I would have to have this. It's just nostalgic and it's important for me, important to learn from, and it is how I learned tarot. So yeah, it has a place in my heart, so I would have to take this one. Next up, it would have to be the very first independent deck I ever picked up, which was the Moonchild Tarot. This deck and I had a really strong bond and I use this such a lot. I really do love this deck still. This is a favourite amongst the community. A lot of people will already know the imagery. It is photo collage and manipulation, but it's just the most beautiful deck, I think. I absolutely just fell in love with this deck. I still can't get over this deck, and I have this kind of connection to this deck that's quite spiritual because I have had dreams about some of the spaces within this deck before I ever had the deck, and it just speaks to me in a really kind of visceral way. It feels a bit like, I don't know, I have a soul connection with this deck. I know that might sound weird, but yeah, maybe this is a soul deck or whatever people say, but yeah, I don't think I could not take this deck. It's just such a beautiful deck and I still absolutely love it. I also think the guidebook's really, really good, and if anyone is starting out, even though the imagery might deviate from the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith system, I still think there is symbolism here, and I still think that the book really, really helps you to learn. So for me, this deck is such an important part of my tarot journey and I just couldn't part with it. I would have to take it with me. Next up, it would have to be the Celtic Wisdom Tarot Pack by Caitlin Matthews, and this deck is somewhat of a soul deck for me as well, and I couldn't part with this either. I work with the Celtic Pantheon quite a lot. I work with the Morrigan. I did actually find out quite recently that I do have some Irish ancestry on my father's side. Not that that matters if you are obviously taking the path seriously and learning and reading the lore and such. Most of the lore that I have read has been related to the Morrigan, but there is a lot of lore and a lot of mythology within this deck, so I couldn't let go of this. I couldn't not have this with me because I feel like I could forever learn from this deck, and the system does deviate slightly away from the Rider-Waite-Smith system too, so I've got some variation here as well, and I also feel like I can read quite intuitively with this deck as well. I think it's beautiful. I just love the illustrations. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I would have to have this deck with me on my desert island. Next up is a release from 2020, and it would have to be the Bonestone and Earthflesh Tarot by Avalon Cameron and Anna Turian. And this deck has just been love from the beginning, and I just love working with it. I think that it just speaks to me, and the imagery is stunning and the readings are amazing. So I have the deck out with me pretty much all the time in my sacred space, and I just pick it up and read with it quite frequently. It is just one of my favourite decks ever, and I'm so happy to have it. I think if it does come out again, I will have to pick up another copy to have a backup. I don't really have double copies of decks other than like Rider-Waite-Smith, and I have a couple of copies of the Mother Piece as well, because I bought one and it turned out to be a mini and I wanted the full size, so I bought the full size. So I do happen to have both the mini and the full-size version of the Mother Piece, but apart from that I tend to just have one copy of each deck. But this is an exception. I just want to have another copy of it basically, so that I can use this but then also have another copy, another backup. So yeah, this is an absolute must for my desert island. And finally, I would have to have the Afro Goddess Tarot Arcanas first edition with me. This is another favourite deck. This is by Andrea Furtick, and I picked mine up in 2020 directly from Andrea. The art in this is just spectacular. I think these are oil paintings, and they are obviously beautiful depictions of goddess figures. Really beautiful melanated deck, and I just love this. I love reading with it. I love looking at the imagery. I just can't get enough of this deck. It's just stunning, and I just wouldn't want to be without it. Love the Empress. So I would definitely have to have this deck with me as well on my desert island. So those are the 5 decks I would have to take with me to my desert island. So the next prompt is, what is your most sassy tarot deck, and what is your most gentle tarot deck, and why did you pick these? This is a really tough one, but I have chosen as my most gentle deck the Oak, Ash and Thorn. I think this deck just feels so lovely and warming and comforting, even though some of the images aren't that comforting to look at really, because you know, it's a tarot deck. There is just something about this deck that is really gentle, and the readings that I've gotten with it have been gentle, even though, like, for instance, that image is not particularly gentle in nature. There's something about reading with this deck that feels like you're having, I don't know, a big hug. So yeah, I think the Oak, Ash and Thorn has got to be one of my most gentle decks for me. And a sassy deck is definitely the Sassarabito, and I really didn't pick it because of the name, but it is funny because some people do call it the sassy burrito within the community. But this deck really has been sassy for me. This deck has spoken out and called me out on several occasions, and it's a bit like a broken record, or a bit like a dog with a bone, you know. It doesn't let things go unless you've kind of worked through them and figured them out, and I love it for that, you know. I really love it. And actually though, I do find the imagery to be so comforting as well at the same time. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons why it's such a popular deck, because it just does this for you so beautifully. It is really sassy, but it is gentle in its delivery in a way. So it is gentle and it is sassy. It's just brilliant. This is definitely one of my favourite decks of all time. Oh, that death card is just beautiful. So those are my 2 picks for that prompt. Share one tarot myth that you used to believe and why you stopped believing it. Oh goodness, I'm not sure. Maybe that tarot is evil. Like, I'm not saying I actually believed that, but I did stop reading tarot. So my story starts with witchcraft, and I started to learn about witchcraft when I was about 11 years old, and I dabbled and I crafted during my teenage years, and I went and did rituals. Sometimes I'd have friends with me. I did rituals on my own as well. I'd go out into nature and do rituals, and I celebrated the Sabbath. I did spells and such, and I dabbled in and out of it. And I came from a Christian background, and whilst my parents are quite open-minded and they weren't ever restrictive, I think my mum might have been a little bit cautious around it, and she was a little bit maybe like, oh, it's a phase, but a little bit like, just be careful darling, you know. And that's fair enough as well. You know, my parents moved house when I was just finishing my A-levels, and I went into a gap year and I started going to a Baptist church. I'd been raised in a Church of England church, and sort of didn't really pay much attention when I was younger, but I did pray and I was at Christian schools. But it was when I was at the Baptist church that I started to build up a connection with Jesus a bit more. But I didn't really understand until I kind of, you know, I had doors shut on me in a sense that, like, oh, you're not allowed to do that, and you're not allowed to do that, and you're not allowed to do that, because the Baptist church was quite different to the Church of England church. As I was learning about all these things, I was suddenly like, oh, well, what about all my witchy books, and what about my tarot deck? Because I just started learning tarot when I was about 17. So 17, yeah, I started to learn tarot and played with it and really enjoyed it and just, yeah, immersed myself in it. But then my only connection to anything really at the time, other than like working as a waitress, was just at the church, and I felt like I couldn't, you know, get to know people, and I don't know, but I was a real sponge. I just thought that I couldn't have both at the same time, and it would be like a dirty little secret, and I didn't want that. So I thought, well, you know, if I come back to this, then it's meant to be, but for now, I'm just going to shelf all this. And what I did was I just took my books to a charity shop, I think, and I took the deck as well. And I think at that time I didn't have an understanding about like the devil card and the death card that I do now, coming from a Christian background, and especially if you're involved in like a Baptist church as well. There's a lot of triggers and a lot of trauma around those kinds of topics and that kind of imagery as well. So I guess for me it's the myth that like tarot is evil or it's going to hurt you in some way, and that the devil card showing up is just a horrible omen, and like just by touching a tarot deck you're going to be in trouble. You know, those kinds of myths that are really just fear-mongering and, you know, a way to control people. That is probably the biggest myth. It's not one particular myth, I don't think, but it is just something that I have come to learn because, you know, coming back to tarot 4 or 5 years ago, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, and following my spiritual path again, it has been so healing for me in so many ways. And I did do a VR to Kellyanne Maddox's Happy Witch Tag, and I talk a little bit more about my experiences in that video. But I do feel that for several years of my life I kind of shut down a little bit inside, like in terms of my spiritual practice, because the stuff that was going on externally, I just didn't have the mental and emotional capacity to even take on those labels or even process or even, yeah, try to get back into it. But it was like coming home, really, and coming back to tarot, it's like coming home. It's just been incredible. So for me, it's not really one myth, it's kind of like a cluster of myths spawned from dogma, essentially. I think I'm only talking about my experiences, of course. I cannot say the same for other people. I also not saying anything about Christianity, but this is just my experience, what happened to me, and that's probably the myth that I would share. Okay, so your thoughts on tarot becoming mainstream. I love being able to watch movies and TV shows about witchcraft and tarot, like popular culture stuff. I like being able to watch documentaries about it, and I also like the normalization of it in terms of like people realizing that witches aren't weird, or like tarot readers aren't evil or weird. I feel like it's quite nice for it to become mainstream, because then, you know, people are more used to talking about it, hearing about it. Of course, there are still misconceptions that get spread around, and we have to then sort of educate people if they want to know, and if they don't, I guess just leave it, you know. Yeah, I think I have mixed feelings. I have mixed feelings about it, because I do think as well that things can be taken the wrong way, and I do think that, as with any other industry, you know, people can be hoodwinked, and there are people out there who aren't genuine. And so yeah, I think there's good and bad. Like, the internet has given us so many wonderful, wonderful things, but, you know, I've been watching some documentaries recently about social media, and there's been some not so great things about that, and that's disturbing and worrying. So, you know, I do think there's good and bad with it as well, but mostly I'm choosing to just think of it in a positive way. Share your first professional reading experience, either as a reader or a seeker. Okay, so I do read tarot for others, but I'm not a professional. I don't sell readings to others. That is something I would like to do one day, and it is something I am thinking about and working towards, but right now I don't. So my first experience of having a tarot reading from a professional was at a local mind, body, spirit fair event, and it was a person who's quite local to me, who lives in my area, who I think is fantastic. And I think primarily she does like astrology. She does like astrological workshops and such. She was really knowledgeable, really interesting. So when she read for me, she didn't actually use a tarot deck. She used a deck that she'd created herself that had astrological correspondences, and she kind of did a reading that was like a zodiac wheel, and she sort of moved it around. Some things she did get right, and it was interesting. I think she was good. I just didn't quite understand what exactly she was doing at the time, and because it was in a mind, body, spirit fair, there wasn't a lot of time either. It was kind of on the clock. I do think it was a good experience though, and I did learn from it. So the next question is, how do you pick your tarot decks for readings? My answer is quite simple for this one because it is intuitive. I just feel into what I need. I can't say much more than it's just intuitive. I just know what I need to go for, if that makes sense. I don't know, it's like I just seem to either have a gut feeling that I have to pick out a certain deck and use it, or I have to specifically tune in a little bit further and then I know which deck, and that's how I pick. I do tend to have certain decks out all the time. They tend to be the favourite ones that I like to work with a lot and that I just love. So yeah, potentially sometimes I reach for my favourites more than the ones that I wouldn't call my favourites or aren't my desert island decks. And I do rotate decks that are out from time to time, but with my favourites I really like to keep them out because I have this bond with them, so I don't really like putting them away. But I will say that having a deck out doesn't necessarily mean that I'll work with it more, because as I said, I really just feel into what I need, and in fact sometimes a deck will be screaming at me. So just the other day, a deck that I purchased quite recently from the Works here in England after seeing on Simon at the Hermit's Caves channel, the Magick of Tarot by Liz Dean. It was a really cheap £6 deck, and I got it because I did like the imagery and I thought, what the hell, you know, £6. And this deck was just screaming at me. Like I couldn't hear it, but look, I could just, when I came into the room the other evening, I could just feel it, and I just needed to get it out, and I did. I pulled it out, opened it up, and 3 cards fell out of this deck, boom boom boom, in order, and they almost like they just made their own spread, and I was like, okay, all right, well, I'll listen. And the cards were the Star, the 3 of Pentacles, and the Moon, and I know what it was talking about, and I know it was a message. So that was really interesting, because I never would have thought that a deck like this would be like that. Like, it's quite pushy, but you know, clearly I had something to say, and I needed to listen, and so I did, and it was interesting. I do intuit what I need to be reading with, mostly. The next question is, how do you feel about tarot deck modification? Do you draw on your decks, trim the borders, or is it a no-go for you? I have dabbled in some deck modification, yes. I picked up a guillotine and a corner rounder and stuff a few years ago, and I did have a go with that, but it didn't really go very well. The guillotine isn't very good because it's not one of those ones you chop down, but it's one of the ones that you sort of score along the card, and it kind of wibbles around. The blade wibbles around within the boundaries, so you can't even get a straight line. It's not very good at all. And the corner rounder, it eats up the corners, so I was like, oh, put off straight away. And I did bodge up a deck, which I'm not so proud about, and some people might not want to hear this, so if you don't like this kind of thing, then maybe switch off now. But I picked up an out-of-print copy of the Shapeshifter Tarot by DJ Conway and Sirona Knight with illustrations from Lisa Hunt, and tried to have a go at this, and it did not work because it was the first time I'd used this guillotine, and whilst I was following Dawn Michelle at Boho Tarot at that point, I don't think she'd done like a proper tutorial at that point. I might be wrong. I'd seen some of her DIYs, but I just thought it was going to be easy enough. But you know, it's not the worst, but you can see it's just not even at all. It's very, very bodged, but I still prefer it, to be honest, to the way it was when I first got it, so I can't say I actually regret it. But yeah, I just wish I'd taken a little bit more time and care with it, and I learnt a bit more first. I did write the elemental symbols on to the cards to make it slightly easier when you're just sort of looking, and I could work with this deck the way it is. I don't mind it the way it is, I just think I could have taken a little bit more care with it, and I thought it's going to be fairly simple and easy to do, and it wasn't so simple and easy to do. Live it, learn it. So I'm sorry if that offended anyone. It's kind of my dirty little secret, but yeah, this is a beautiful deck, and Lisa Hunt's artwork is stunning. I am really glad I got it. I think the modification that I've done the most is edging decks. So I've edged quite a lot of decks in silver and gold and bronze, and I've used markers in the past. I've used like Sharpie markers to edge things, and I've also used those stamps that Dawn Michelle at Boho Tarot talks about. But I stopped edging so much at some point last year because I had so many decks coming into my collection, and I just kind of ran out of steam with it a little bit, and I haven't really felt the need to. I quite like, if decks don't come with edging, I quite like that natural sort of element to them. If a deck does come in that I want to edge, I'm sure I will do that again, and I might consider doing a modification again because I think that they can look really, really good. It's just I need to practice a little bit. Live it, learn it. The next prompt is, what questions do you most often ask the tarot for yourself and for others? So for others, it's usually around life type scenarios, sort of like personal, family, home situations, kids, that kind of thing, because I read for friends and those are their questions. And for myself, it's similar. I have done spreads for work before, but mostly it's about my family life. But I would say more often than not, I do spreads about my relationship with my children and our home life. And I do a lot of spreads for self-love and shadow work purposes. So sort of more introspective, you know, what is my feeling around this, why am I feeling this, kind of like releasing those kinds of sort of topics. So it's not so much like when will I meet the one, or when will I get this job, or anything like that, but it's sort of more like a spread tailored towards delving deeper into a particular shadow, or working with some fear, or learning to get past some limiting beliefs, or learning to love something about myself more. So it's more of those kinds of introspective sorts of questions rather than sort of surfacey sorts of questions. The next question is, share one of the new things you learnt about tarot in the last year. Well, I must have learnt something. I think in the last year I've learned a lot more about appropriation in decks, and I've learned about diversity in decks and inclusion in decks, and you know, just thinking about the ethics around creating decks and whitewashing of decks. And when I first started collecting decks, I had a lot of oracle decks, and I picked up a lot of goddess themed decks, and I still have a lot of them. There's one particular deck that I would like to remove from my collection at some point, but I don't really want anyone else to have it either, because it makes me feel uncomfortable putting that back out into the community. And obviously some people have fantastic relationships with that deck, but since getting those decks several years ago, I've learnt more about the creator of those decks, who is quite prominent in the industry, and I have not been so enamored with some of the things I have learnt, and I can definitely see cultural appropriation and whitewashing within the deck and other decks, and I'm just not so comfortable having that in my collection anymore. But I also feel troubled about giving it to someone else or selling it as well. Like, it just doesn't feel right. So I still have it, but I don't use it. I don't consider it to be part of my collection, and I would not purchase from that particular creator anymore for those reasons, that I just feel very uncomfortable about it. So I think within the last year I've learnt more about cultural appropriation within tarot and oracle, and I've learnt more about whitewashing, diversity in tarot, but also the importance for creators to research their work, and also a lot more about how much whitewashing and cultural appropriation there is in certain decks, especially decks that are really mainstream, and that is quite tough to see. And I think, yeah, that is what I've been educating myself around, or you know, that is what I've been learning from other creators within the community, and I've been very, very happy to listen and learn those things, and I want to learn more and I want to do better. And so that is really a focus. It's still a focus. It's an ongoing learning process. It's a very, very important learning process. It's really, really important to me as someone who is using tarot daily and considers it a huge part of their life. You know, this is not something I'm willing to ignore. So I'm not happy for decks like that to stay in my collection. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest learning curve over the past year. Share a tarot deck that you have to break up with. So there's a tarot deck that I shared previously on my channel that I do want to break up with. I shared that in the VR to Candy, Soul and Soils hashtag dating the tarot, and that is the Mystic Dreamer. I don't particularly enjoy this deck. I just don't feel that it resonates with me at all. I really don't enjoy the yellow borders. I think they are so big and you can't see the artwork. all of the figures are white and young and thin, and there's no diversity whatsoever, and it's airbrushed to death because it's obviously collage and photo manipulation, and I just don't think it's for me. Yeah, I thought that it was very fantastical and beautiful when I saw the pictures online, like the colours and everything. It just doesn't translate. I think I thought it might be a bit like the Moonchild, but it's just nothing like that. And so for me, this is not a deck I want to keep, and I have shared that before. This is no offence to the creator. You know, I do think there are some pretty images. It's just with the border and the lack of diversity, it's just not for me at all. And the goddess deck I was just talking about is Colette Baron Reid's Goddess Power Oracle, and I know that this is a favourite for a lot of people. I never felt like I connected with it, however, and then I learned more about it when I watched a video from a creator on YouTube who had taken a course and paid a lot of money to work with Colette Baron Reid, and I just found it very, very disturbing to learn about some of the ways that these images were created and some of the claims that the creator made. Yeah, I was disappointed because I first thought this was so beautiful, but it does not feel right. I do enjoy Alana Fairchild's work, for instance, and I have several of her oracles, but I will not be getting the Kali Oracle for the reason that I don't feel that it is representative as far as I have seen from learning from people who are within that particular culture. So I do enjoy Alana Fairchild's work, for instance, but I have also learnt more about the way that that deck has been created, and just not happy about the depictions because of what I've learnt about how they are not exactly representative of, you know, how the goddess would have been depicted originally. So it doesn't sit right. So this is another deck that I've already broken up with it, to be honest. It's still here because I don't want to sell it to anyone because I don't feel that that's ethical. I think maybe if one of my friends wants to use it, if I talk to them about it, I'd be happy to pass it on as long as I am able to tell them what I know about it and why I'm passing it on. But I don't think I would sell it. It's just not something I'd feel comfortable with at all. But those are the two decks that I really do need to break up with, and pretty much have broken up with. And that brings me to the end of 31 Days of Tarot 2021 by Ethony Dawn, and I'm just so... I feel kind of emotional. This has been so much fun. It's been so lovely to share my responses to these prompts, and it's been so wonderful to see everyone else's responses as well. I just absolutely love these hashtags, and I've just been so thrilled to take part in the last few months. I cannot tell you how much happiness and joy it brings me to be able to do that. So yeah, it's just been such a pleasure. So I really hope that you've enjoyed watching my responses to these prompts, and that you've enjoyed watching 31 Days of Tarot. I hope that it's been interesting or informative or inspiring or funny or in some way entertaining, and thank you so much for joining me. If you did enjoy the video, do give it a thumbs up and click the like button, and share it with anyone who you think would be interested to see. Also, if you'd like to see more from me around tarot, magic, spirituality, witchcraft, those kinds of topics, then please do think about subscribing, and while you're subscribing, do remember to hit that little bell notification, because that's how YouTube is going to let you know when I create and upload videos like this one. So with all of that said, thank you again so much for joining me. I really hope that you stay well and safe, and sending you many blessings, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video really soon. Take care. Bye. Mwah.